On this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, it is an episode dedicated to you, our wonderful viewers on YouTube, our wonderful followers on X. We asked you for topics. We asked you for questions. You guys came through. We were able to put them into three groupings. Damichael Cole and I on this episode, closing out the month of January. We're going to focus on the three new Grizzlies signings via hardship waiver. Some light injury updates, maybe a reorganization of the injury report, if you will. And we also have some ideas for trades going into the trade deadline. All that and more on this special edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax. So happy to have you with us wherever you are, however you're taking in the podcast. It is much appreciated as always. I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. Damichael, how are you doing, sir?
Doing great, Joe. Another day to talk Grizzlies basketball, man.
Yeah, and again, we wanted to honor and celebrate our wonderful followers on YouTube and Twitter and give them a chance to steer the show today, and that's exactly what they've done. Thanks to everybody for all the comments and replies on, I think I might have said Twitter, on X, whatever the heck they call it, right? Social media of the guy that puts brain chips in people's heads, okay? So whether it's over on X or on YouTube, whatever the case might be, we are very grateful for all the different comments, all the different questions, and, of course, the subscriptions getting us past that 3,000 mark before the month ended. So you guys guided the show today, and we'll tackle your topics here momentarily. Friendly reminder that this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, like every episode of Locked On Grizzlies, is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Again, you can also check us out on YouTube. Thank you for making Damichael and I a part every single day, hopefully. If not every single day, if this is your first time coming through, maybe every few days. Hopefully you'll come around each and every time a new episode of Locked On Grizzlies drops. Damichael, we talked about, this being an opportunity for our wonderful viewers on YouTube, our followers on X, to guide the program. And there was a lot of good questions and comments. I was able to kind of group them all into three general topics. So the first thing we're going to talk about on this episode is the new Grizzlies, because the hardship waivers cleared, and then it was like a rainfall of basketball players. It was like an Avengers Endgame when Hawkeye comes back and he says, "Hey, Cap, on your left," right? And then all the Avengers come up, and it's Thanos knows he's doomed. That's kind of the help has arrived. The cavalry is here. Some guys that maybe we're familiar with a little bit, depending on how into the weeds you are in the NBA G League, and maybe some names that we're not as familiar with. So, Damichael, why don't you talk us through these signings, including the one that literally played in a basketball game for the Grizzlies on Monday night because they only had 8 guys, and if he hadn't played, Memphis wouldn't have been able to play the darn basketball game.
Wouldn't have been able to play the basketball game. You need 8 players, 8 active players. And the Grizzlies were right on the fence in this game. But you know what? Matthew Hurt got the 10-day deal. So before we get into that, the hardship exceptions, I've been asked about it a lot.
Yeah.
And people have said, how can the Grizzlies sign 1 guy, 2 guys, 3 guys? How does this work? Well, in the simplest form, what you have here is basically in the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, it is outlined that a team that has more than 4 players out with long-term injuries can apply for a hardship waiver, and it's very likely, and it's going to get accepted. Once that's the case, you can sign a player to a 10-day. Now, once you have more than 4 players, like you have 5 guys, now you can get 2 guys in 10 days, 6, so forth. And if you look at the Grizzlies right now, I mean, pretty much the entire starting lineup alone, meets the criteria there. John Morant, Desmond Bane, Steven Adams, Marcus Smart. Then when you get into Jake LaRavia, that's a 5th guy, Brandon Clark. That's 6 guys right there, which allows the Grizzlies to go get 3 hardship waivers. And the way this works is, of course, we'll see how long they need these guys. But after the first 10 days, I think maybe Jake LaRavia, because he'll be less than, because long-term injuries are classified as longer than 2 weeks. Jake LaRavia, I believe, was given a 3-week timeline of reevaluation. So we'll see kind of what happens on that end. Maybe they bring one of the guys back, two of the guys back. But here's what we know about this guy. Matthew Hurt, you saw it up close. Everyone saw it up close. If you've been watching the Memphis Hustle, you weren't really surprised. I mean, the guy can flat out shoot the basketball. He played with the Grizzlies a little bit in the preseason, a little sparingly, but he was around the team. He practiced with the team. He's kind of that stretch 4 mode defensively. Not really your NBA type defender that, if you're wondering what's kind of been holding him back, a little bit slow, feet wise.
A little bit slow.
Hey,
little bit slow.
He's got quicksand in his feet, Joe. There you go. That's what you want to hear, Joe.
If he were any slower, he'd be called molasses, is what it would be.
But offensively, very skilled guy. And the other two guys. So you got Tosan Iwobama. Is it? Let me go back to the pronunciation guide on this
you
one.
You might have gotten it on the first try there, Damichael.
Tosan Iwoma.
Iwoma.
Yeah, that's how it's pronounced. And he's kind of sort of your Swiss Army knife in this group. A solid rebounder, a solid playmaker. Played on that Princeton team, if you're a March Madness fan out there. The team that beat Missouri in the NCAA tournament, and he was kind of the leader in the game. So if you want to really see him kind of shine, go back and watch that game. Mark Spears over at Anscape also wrote a story, about him after that game as well. He's from England, and he's kind of had to carve his own route to get to the league here. But decent shooter, doesn't really shoot it a lot, but he is very capable of knocking it down. He's kind of the Swiss Army knife of this group. Think of a guy who can score, he can rebound, and he can pass the ball. Not necessarily great at any of those areas, but good enough to play in the NBA for sure at this point. Trey Jemison is the one that everyone's kind of been talking about for the longest. As a matter of fact, we talked about him here on Locked On Grizzlies. Mm-hmm. Solid low post presence. When I think Trey Jemison, I just think of the defensive side of the basketball. Sure, you're going to get the dunks and whatnot, but defensively is where he's kind of carved out a role, at this level. He's a solid defensive maker. You're talking 6'10", 260-pound guy. He's going to block some shots. And right now, if you look at the bodies that the Grizzlies have inside, they don't have that type of imposing presence to go alongside of a Jaren Jackson Jr. The other guys we're talking about is Santi Aldama, who's a little frail, and Xavier Tillman, who is a solid defender, but he's 6'8". Guys are just shooting over the top of him in certain situations. So now you get Trey Jemison into the fold. I think he can really help from a physicality standpoint.
I think that, of the three options, Hurt is the one that's least likely to stick. I think that he can shoot the basketball. I think that he has the connection to the Memphis Hustle. They're rewarding a guy that's done some good things in the G League for them. The Grizzlies have a tendency to do that from time to time, a little bit of a payday bump, those sorts of things. I think if it comes down to the way that you explained it to Michael, and maybe, LaRavia can come back, but the other guys are still out, I think it's Hurt that'll go back to the G League. I like Jemison. Yeah. I like him a lot. I think that there's interesting talents and replication of skill there in terms of his size. And Iwoma, I love this guy. I have no idea if it's actually going to translate to the NBA, but I watched some of those Princeton highlights, and I remember him now. I'll be honest, I didn't remember him at the time.
They dominated Missouri.
I remember that game for that exact reason, and it was an impressive showing. He's a jack of all trades. He's a Swiss Army knife. He has a frame that he looks like he could almost play all 5 positions on the floor. Maybe he doesn't do any of them particularly well, as you alluded to, but he has that versatility. And again, for a roster that is this banged up, Iwoma makes a ton of sense for that versatile type of player. It's almost like a souped up David Roddy in that way. But in your opinion, Damichael, do you see Hurt being the one that could potentially stick, or are you with me that, all 3 of these guys probably won't stick, but who do you think is going to best utilize this NBA opportunity between the 3 of them?
Yeah, I'm flipped around from you, Joe. You said Hurt is the least likely. For me, he is the most likely.
Interesting. Don't you think he's a bit redundant with Jake LaRavia?
He is, but he's better. He's better right now.
Whoa. Hold the phone. Time out. You're saying that
he's better.
He is better than Jake LaRavia right now.
Right now. For sure.
Wow.
Now, granted, all around game, Joe, I might give you that, but when you watch them, go look at them play in the G League. Both of these guys have played a lot of minutes in the G League, and Matthew Hurst's numbers this year are much better than Jake LaRavia's numbers in his time down there as well. We see the confidence with the shooting. I mean, he made more three-pointers in one quarter than Jake LaRavia has made the entire season for the Memphis Grizzlies. And that's LaRavia's calling card, right? I mean, we got Joe Mullinax on Locked On Grizzlies backing up Jake LaRavia today. What's really going on? But here's the thing, Joe. I think Jake LaRavia is an upside guy. You see the fadeaway, solid footwork offensively and all that, but he hasn't really put it together yet. And plus, by the time he's back, the 10-day of Matthew Hurt will be long expired. So I don't think we're going to get in a situation where it's LaRavia or Hurt at any point, because you only can sign guys to 2 10 days. Once you sign them to the second 10-day, you have to either keep them on the roster or you can't retain them. So I think by the time LaRavia returns, he's either a roster guy or he's not on the roster, and it's hard to see any of these guys sticking on the roster based on the current landscape.
Goodness gracious. What does that say about that draft pick, if that is a true statement, that Jake LaRavia is not as good as Matthew Hurt? Yikes. Well, we'll talk more about Jake LaRavia throughout the show. We're going to be talking injury updates. Nothing too substantial. The Grizzlies practice today. That's important to understand. So we'll get more definite information going into our next episode. But again, this episode was guided by our wonderful listeners and viewers, so we wanted to keep it true to that. So we'll talk a little bit about injuries, maybe which ones are closer to returning than others. That'll come up next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by eBay Motors. It's that time again. Damichael, our partners at eBay Motors, have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. Let's see who Josh has picked out for us on this week's eBay Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. We're familiar with Jared Vanderbilt here in Memphis. We remember him from the Los Angeles Lakers series. We've also saw him in the Minnesota Timberwolves series a couple seasons ago. We are well aware of what Vanderbilt brings to the table. Josh says that the Lakers lineups have seemed to work a lot better of late with Vando in them. The coach has been stubborn in deploying them, Darvin Ham. Still, his fantasy value is on the rise, and he fits in a few different fantasy builds. Josh Lloyd from Locked On Fantasy Basketball is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is about being a perfect fit with each player. Same thing with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one whip, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED lights, bumpers, whatever your car needs, eBay Motors has it. With the eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. At these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die car alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to United States customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Damichael Cole, we are looking at injuries now. And again, we mentioned a moment ago the idea of this team's injury report still in notes section, right? Like on an Apple iPhone, you have to take a screenshot of your notes. You can't just type it into an X post. That's how bad things have gotten in terms of health for the Memphis Grizzlies. More definite information likely to come out after today's practice. But again, multiple listeners, multiple viewers on YouTube asked for injury updates. So maybe organizing these in terms of likely to return soon-ish. We talked about Jake LaRavia a little bit in that way. Guys that we know for sure aren't coming back this season, John Morant, Steven Adams, those sorts of things. And then the names that are in between kind of help our viewers and our listeners make sense of the current state of play for Grizzlies injuries going into practice today, where we should get some more updated information.
Yeah, I think Derrick Rose is the big question mark when you talk about who's close, who's far away. He's been working out before the games a little bit and things like that more, which is something he wasn't really doing much of a couple weeks ago. So there is progress there. But again, as you alluded to, we'll know more kind of on Derrick Rose and kind of have a more definitive update on him for tomorrow's show. Everyone else still seems kind of far away at this point because they all have to get reevaluated. That's kind of like the thing. And if you know, with the Grizzlies, once you reach that reevaluation period, sometimes you don't know what's going to happen. But in the case of Desmond Bane, for example, I think he's one of the more encouraging ones as you get towards that 6-week evaluation stretch. I believe Mike Wallace has said it that believes that, Desmond Bane is ahead of pace. I myself said it here on Locked On Grizzlies a couple days ago that I've actually been hearing as well that Desmond Bane is really pushing to kind of be right at that 6-week timeline and potentially even beat it. But that's kind of a mentality thing with Desmond Bane as well. He's only been injured pretty much 3 times in his basketball life where he's had real serious injuries in his mind. And he told me it was the back injury. It was the injury last year with his foot. And then it's the one he has right now. Outside of that, TCU, he pretty much played every single game. So he's pushing the envelope there. I think you talk about between him, Marcus Smart, he is closer to returning. Marcus Smart still has a splint on his hand. So since the splint has not been removed yet, he is still doing very limited activity with that hand. So I believe the splint won't be removed until his evaluation period is up, and then he'll be able to do basketball activity. So amongst that group, I think Derrick Rose is probably the closest one. We'll know more definitively. Jake LaRavia shouldn't be far away as well. And then Desmond Bane, it's sounding like somewhere around All-Star break, we should have a very definitive answer on when he'll be back.
Brandon Clark has been doing more before games as well. Every once in a while, you'll see a post from either our friend Parker Fleming, somebody else in Grizzlies media, a picture of Brandon Clark doing a dunk, Brandon Clark doing some sort of pregame workout. A lot of the guys do that, as you alluded to. They'll get their work in, even in the injured guys. They'll do some practice drills, whatever the case might be. They'll go shower, change back into their street clothes, and then they'll head to the bench for the game. Do you have any semblance of an idea, again, understanding the practices today? Maybe there's more of an update coming out of that practice. Looking at Brandon Clark, the time frame was always around the trade deadline-ish. Have you seen anything to suggest that's not going to happen, or do you think Clark is still on track for a late February or mid to late February post-All-Star break return?
Yeah, I think he's definitely on track in terms of where he is physically. He looks good, seeing him, move around and things like that. You mentioned him working out before the games and whatnot. I'm sure we'll see him a little bit, at practice later today as well. But timeline-wise, we haven't heard much, from Taylor Jenkins in terms of how the Grizzlies, their plan of attack for this, because it could be different now. And we don't know yet in terms of what this team's record, how that will play into the effectiveness in terms of how they plan on using Brandon Clark. It could be a situation where they say, the record really doesn't matter. You want to get him some game reps. Or it could be a situation where they say, we're not really in it right now. We're going to just take this a little slow and pretty much let him get a full off season where he continues to get closer to 100% or pretty much be at 100%. But physically, he looks great. He looks explosive, which I wanted to make sure I pointed out to you, Joe Mullinax, because you kind of thought he was going to come back jumping around like Jokic or something, but he looks pretty explosive, Joe.
Well, I do think there's a difference between in-game explosivity and jumping at the rim when nobody's around you trying to defend you or foul you. It is good to see that, and I do hope, because Brandon Clark is such an important piece of this. He's been out for a while. Maybe folks have forgotten that. Maybe you're new to the Grizzlies and you haven't watched Brandon Clark play. When Brandon Clark's at his best, this team, you could argue, is a legitimate title contender when healthy. That's how good Brandon Clark can be for them if he recovers nicely from this injury. And that ties in, closing out this part of the conversation, Damichael, whether it's Clark, Marcus Smart, how much of a rush would you be to see these guys get back out on the floor? I don't know that Memphis is tanking. We've talked about that a little bit. Doesn't necessarily make sense for them to tank. They're not going to be as bad as the Pistons or the Spurs or the Wizards. The bottom 4 teams in the NBA are pretty well set. But Brandon Clark coming off of an Achilles is a little more serious than a finger injury. Do you anticipate them taking it slow? What angle do you see them playing? Sure, maybe Clark is eligible to play March 1st, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's on the floor March 1st.
Yeah, I think they'll play him based on what we see right now. Now, again, the roster construction was going to tell us everything we need to know. Right now, the Grizzlies don't have a lot of front court depth. That's why they went out and got Trey Jemison. And, again, that's a 10-day contract. So he's probably not going to be on the roster by the point Brandon Clark returns, for example. And Xavier Tillman is someone who we will potentially talk about in the next segment or in future episodes as we get closer to that point, it's someone that could be traded at the deadline. He's on an expiring contract. He's on a very cheap contract. Teams will covet a kind of a defensive big man who is on a cheap contract that won't cost you much. So if you take a trade for Xavier Tillman, who you're probably not re-signing anyway, now you only have a couple of guys in Jaren Jackson Jr. and Santi Aldama that you're playing. So they'll either need to get another big, in a trade or, a 10-day or whatever the case may be, but they'll need someone else on that roster. And if they're comfortable enough trading away Xavier Tillman Sr., for example, then I think that kind of tells us everything we know with the plan to Brandon Clark, because you're going to need to play him at that point. You're going to need minutes from him. So based on the way the roster looks right now, I see no reason why he doesn't play this season. I fully expect him to.
That's a great point, and that will tie into our next segment. If Brandon Clark's going to play, Xavier Tillman's probably not long for this Grizzlies world, and that'll be an interesting kind of balancing act to see as the trade deadline approaches. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we will talk about that NBA trade deadline, some trade ideas, possibilities for Memphis moving things around. I wouldn't expect them to do too much, but there's always a chance, and we'll break that down a little bit for our listeners and viewers who asked us to, coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, I want to remind you that Locked On Sports Today has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn understands that at the start of the new year, every small business owner is asking themselves the same question. One move that they can make that'll take their business to the next level. LinkedIn Jobs knows that success depends on the people that you surround yourself with and the team that you build. That's why LinkedIn Jobs has created tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just another job board. It has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. Thankfully, with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, quick, and easy. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we close out with trade ideas heading into the NBA trade deadline for these Memphis Grizzlies. Stick around. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, one of your hosts for this episode, joined by my co-host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. I've been covering the Grizzlies for over a decade here, there, and everywhere. You've come to the right place for Memphis Grizzlies content this and every day here on Locked On Grizzlies. Damichael, this episode has been dedicated to our faithful commenters and followers on YouTube and on X. Lots of good input. We've grouped a lot of these similar questions into 3 categories. We talked about the new Grizzlies signings. We talked about injuries, different perspectives on those. Again, more definitive information will probably be available on our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies, especially with regard to Derrick Rose, as you alluded to. That leads us to what a majority of folks asked about last, and that is trade ideas. Now, this kind of coincides and works out nicely with the tweet that came out from Adrian Wojnarowski, or the post, whatever it's called, goodness gracious, on the thing formerly known as Twitter. Woj posted the projected 2024-2025 salary cap levels. This is a little in the weeds. We're not going to talk too much about it because I might make you fall asleep. The main number that our listeners and viewers need to know, Damichael, is $179 million. That is the amount for the first apron level over the salary tax. The reason that number matters is they are likely to be closer to that number next year than the $190 million that is the second apron level. There are so many more punitive things that happen to a team in terms of building a roster when you pass that second apron of the tax. It is extremely unlikely that even if you want to say Robert Perry is one of the richest owners in the NBA, that might be true. Just for the sake of building a team, it's unlikely that Memphis goes past that second apron. So between 179 and 190 million is where this Memphis roster is probably going to live. That almost certainly means a couple of the guys currently on this Grizzlies roster will not be here this time next year as they try to avoid it. Because as things stand right now, they're past the first apron without signing a lottery pick first rounder. They're going to go past the second apron. Something's got to give to Michael.
Something's got to give. And to me, that's why this year, honestly, it's going to sting a little bit for a while. I don't want to really just harp on that point too much, but this is the last year of Desmond Bane's rookie contract, and you got the first year of Ja's, second deal and whatnot. So this was kind of the year where you could have went out. Like if all those guys were healthy, you could have made a big swing with moving one of those bench pieces who have, a decent sized contract to kind of add to that core. And now that's really, kind of an outside option. So yes, it hurts. But if you look at the future of this team around those guys, that's the core. Again, we know the Jaren Jackson Jr. extension talks will probably be a conversation that we get into next season and whatnot. But to me, Joe, it's all about those first round picks of the last couple of years. That's where the money, when you talk about the difference between staying maybe below that first apron, being above the first apron, and avoiding the second apron, it's that Zaire Williams, contract where he's projected to make around $6-7 million next season. Yep. It's the Jake LaRavia contract. It's David Rice contract, even to a lesser degree. These are all former first round picks who, at the end of the day, don't really look like first round picks. And we know that because Vince Williams and Gigi Jackson was drafted in the second round, and especially Vince Williams, it looks better than those guys from what we've seen. With all that being said, you have excellent value in Vince Williams' contract. You're probably going to get decent value whenever you sign Gigi Jackson, and it's probably something you want to do going into the offseason for sure. Now, my thing is Zaire Williams is the main guy that I think if you're going to move someone, that's the guy that I would say you want to get off that contract because, yes, next season would be his final year as opposed to Jake LaRavia. You got him 2 more seasons, in addition to not only just this season, but next season and the year after that. So that's probably one that you want to move as well. But it's playing to Zaire Williams. We've been here a while now, Joe. We said it before the season. He said no one worked harder than me. And we got to be honest at some point. If he's worked harder than anyone, and these are the results that we've seen, I don't think he can really push himself that much more. He's getting all the opportunities right now with guys out. And we haven't seen Zaire Williams kind of separate himself. But you know what? There may be a team out there that says, hey, this guy is a former 5-star recruit. This guy is a former top 10 pick. And maybe a different situation. You see the flashes. He's coming off. He's had a couple good games recently. You see the flashes and whatnot. Go to a different situation, and a team says, hey, we get him, we fill him out for the rest of this season, and he goes into our offseason program for the entirety of the offseason, and we get a full year to see what we want to do with him. There may be a team out there that says a 6'8", 6'9" wing that is a proven solid defender. He may be worth a shot. So I think that's the guy. Now, again, as I saw Bobby Marks, ESPN's kind of salary cap guru, say, you can't dance on the dance floor without having a dance partner. So you're going to need a partner to make it happen. But that's kind of the main guy that stands out to me, Joe.
I think that's a good pick. I'll do you one better that's going to hurt my heart a little bit. Luke Canard, I think, would be an option
right now.
That would make sense for a team that's trying to compete, a team that is thinking long-term in terms of their own salary cap situation. I look at the Indiana Pacers and Buddy Hield being an expiring contract that maybe they're not going to be able to re-sign that guy. You have Luke Canard come in. Mm-hmm. He's on a team option, I think, for around $14 million next year. That's certainly less than what you would imagine Buddy Hield would make in free agency. I think that there is a lane for a Canard deal that would help a team like an Indiana. Imagine Canard in that Indiana offense. And it would also put Memphis in a position to avoid that spot entirely if they don't have a dance partner for somebody like a Zaire Williams or a Xavier Tillman. You could also pair Tillman's smaller deal with either of those contracts more than likely and find a way to make a trade happen. I see them prioritizing second-round picks. To be honest with you, they've had more success with those recently. Vince Williams Jr. and Gigi Jackson being a great example of that. The way that you sign those guys to a contract is also a little bit more team-friendly in terms of control. Yeah. So I think you tag Zaire and X and you get a couple of second-rounders for that kind of stings, Zaire was a first, like you said, top 10 lottery pick. But at least you're getting something, and it's something that can help you build your roster around your new reality that you alluded to. The fact that you're going to have Ja Morant and Desmond Bane as max contract guys. Jaren Jackson Jr. is not coming at a discount this time around. He's going to be another max contract guy, you'd imagine. Mm-hmm. And with 3 max contract guys on the roster, things get fishy in terms of the numbers around those guys. I believe that Robert Perez, Zach Kleiman, they're planning to be in the luxury tax. I do believe that. I think that they're willing to do that to keep that core together. Are they going to be a second apron team? For a variety of reasons, no. Whether it's the money that goes along with that, and the tax and the punishment for that, whether it is, again, the inability to do certain things in and around the salary cap, trades, veteran minimum signings, whatever the case might be, it just gets a lot harder to build a team if you're above that second apron. So for a market like Memphis, that just doesn't make sense. So I do think they'll live in that 179 to 190 million world. They're pretty close to the second apron going into next year with the group that they've currently constructed, whether it's now or whether it's as simple as not picking up Luke Kennard's option this offseason. Something's got to give. But I would also rather them get something for Canard now. And it stings to say that because I love Luke Kennard, but are we talking about trading Marcus Smart and his $18 million contract?
Absolutely not.
So somebody's got to go. Steven Adams, in terms of his contract being an expiring deal. I love Steven Adams. I think he fits. And that really drives home the point that you made a moment ago, Damichael. This year's going to sting for a while. Because if all these guys could have been healthy, I think we're talking about a team that's in the top 2 or 3 of the Western Conference. And we're looking at potential playoff matchups at this point, not trades that are trying to avoid the luxury tax second apron. And that's just the tough spot that Memphis is in this year.
Yeah, I think it's not even this season is kind of going to sting because it's a lost championship season. It's a lost opportunity right before Desmond Bane's contract kicks in, where you have a clear identity of what's needed going forward. We didn't see enough of Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, and Jaren Jackson Jr. on the floor this season to say that's a championship contender. I mean, it looked good, 6-3 and whatnot, but we didn't see enough. We didn't see them go on the road and play, the Boston Celtics. We didn't see them, take on the Minnesota Timberwolves and those type of teams. We didn't see them go against the Oklahoma City Thunder. So we did not see enough, even though it looked good for that 9-game stretch. And that's kind of where it stings because now you're going into this next offseason and you're still kind of swinging for the fences, but the resources are going to be a little bit smaller. Now, I agree with you right there on I think our overall point, which, Joe, we seem to do a lot. Like, we have different ways of getting there, but we agree at the end of the day. I think we both agree from the standpoint that the biggest key at the trade deadline should be creating roster flexibility. Now, my way of getting there is a little bit different than yours because I think that the Grizzlies, they have these assets that they've kind of accumulated that they haven't used yet, and now this is the time to potentially use some of them. I agree with you from the standpoint of you might want to come off of a Tillman for a second-round pick or something like that, and you don't really have to get a salary back. You don't have to get a salary back because you have that Dylan Brooks traded player exception that's estimated to be around $7 million. Same thing with another player. If you want to move, say, John Conchar, for example, you can move John Conchar for, a couple second-round picks or whatever the case may be, and you don't have to take a player back. You can just get a salary filler in terms of the traded player exception and a second-round pick. That'll create roster flexibility, not only for the remainder of this season where you can potentially sign one of those 10-day guys, or check this out, Joe. You can use your injury exception. One of them, you got one that's about $6.3 million from Steven Adams, and you got another one that's around $12.4 million for Ja Morant. And if you use one of those, remember, you only can use it for a player that's signed just through the rest of the season. So you can't go into next season with signed player using that trade exception because Ja Morant or Steven Adams were projected to be back at that point. So I think you got all these assets. You say, hey, we can ship one of those guys out. You create that roster flexibility. And guess what? You still have that roster flexibility at the end of the season because I think roster spots are more important right now than sheer dollars. The dollars are right behind it. But creating those roster spots so you can – because you got to sign a first-round pick. Gigi Jackson needs to be addressed. because even if you don't plan on keeping him long term, he is an asset, and that's something we can talk about way down the stretch. But you kind of just got to approach this from a standpoint of roster flexibility is the key.
How much are you going to make people mad if you say that GG Jackson is not part of their long-term plan?
I'm not saying that. I just said it. Maybe it could be a
Michael
conversation.
said that, not me.
I'm not saying that.
You picked John Conchar over GG Jackson a couple days ago.
Oh boy!
And now you're talking about if GG's part of the future. I don't know, YouTube commenters. You might want to give that to Michael Cole a hard time for his hate on GG Jackson. I'm just kidding, of course. But speaking of our YouTube commenters, thank you so much to everybody that chimed in, whether it was on X or on YouTube. Thanks for helping us guide this episode of the show. It is much appreciated. And thank you one more time for getting us past 3,000 subscribers on YouTube. Onward and upward, partner, to 4,000. I know we'll get there here soon. Next time we're together on Locked On Grizzlies, we'll be breaking down all the updates from practice. Damichael's going to have all sorts of goodies for us, I am sure. We also will be talking Grizzlies basketball again. Grizzlies have a big game coming up, of course. Every game is big when you're the Memphis Grizzlies. This time it's against the Cleveland Cavaliers. It might be an interesting time, Damichael, to compare and contrast, because Cleveland's had some injury issues themselves this season. Yeah. And maybe not quite as bad as Memphis, but still not great. Cleveland remains one of the elite teams in the Eastern Conference, and obviously Memphis is in the spot they're in. So maybe how Cleveland got their job done, what Memphis can maybe learn from that experience. Lots of different angles we can take going into our Thursday episode of Locked On Grizzlies. For Damichael, I'm Joe. Until next time, stay locked in. Remember to check out Locked On Sports Today on YouTube, 24/7 sports streaming channel. Great perspective from myself, Damichael, other Locked On hosts, the Locked On NBA crew, Locked On NFL, all sorts of different things. Check out Locked On Sports Today. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Grizzlies every day. And until next time, for Damichael, I'm Joe. Stay locked in. We'll catch you next time here on Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much. Have a good one.